So welcome to tonight's talk. Tonight I'd like to talk about the unconditioned, nibbana, the ultimate aim of all Buddhist practices, actually. And to do that, I'll firstly give a very brief history of Buddhism and highlight some of the developmental shifts and changes that have happened over time as Buddhism spread across the globe. So, and I'll finish it up with talking about practices practices that I feel are directed at the direct perception of the unconditioned. The perception, the realisation, the direct realisation of the unconditioned. So, that which has come to be known as Buddhism began in northern India around 2,600 years ago. And it began with the awakening of Siddhartha Gautama. When he woke up, he became a Buddha. That's what a Buddha means. It means an awakened one. And what he awoke to, or what he woke up to, were four truths, four noble truths. And these noble truths are, the first noble truth is the truth or the reality of dukkha. Dukkha usually translates as unsatisfactoriness. Often it's called suffering, but I think it's probably best to understand it as unsatisfactoriness. The second noble truth is the origins of suffering as coming from greed, ignorance and hatred in general. The third noble truth is freedom from suffering, or nibbana. And the fourth noble truth is the way of freedom, the way of the Dharma, the Eightfold Path. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, which has three components: wisdom, right view and intention, ethics, speech, action, and livelihood, and meditation, or bhavana, meaning energy, mindfulness, and concentration. So, what's the first truth, dukkha, involves a broad range of experiences, from the very gross and severe to the very subtle. And you've heard me talk about this probably many times. The very gross is the very hell-like realms of aging, sickness and death, like war and famine and all these really terrible experiences that we can experience. And the subtle is the very subtle unsatisfactoriness. And I always make a joke about not getting your soy chai latte the same, exactly how you want it. You've heard me say that joke before many times. But anyway, it's that spectrum of unsatisfactoriness. Sometimes dukkha is described as a characteristic of existence, right? A universal characteristic of existence. And there are two other universal characteristics of existence, being impermanence and not self, or emptiness. So these characteristics of existence go together, and because conditioned things change, you're unable to find enduring happiness in them, which is what dukkha is. And because conditioned experiences change, there's nothing independent we can find within it. Everything arises out of the coming together of many causes and conditions. Therefore, it's considered as not self or empty of single thingness. Okay, So, nibbana, or the third truth, is has no suffering because it isn't subject to change. It doesn't arise and it doesn't pass away. It's unconditioned. Therefore, it's not suffering. So if you can understand the reason why we have suffering is because things change. It's, there's a generalised unsatisfactoriness because conditions arise in you. We might have blissful joy in one moment and then, horrible misery in the next moment. So there's dukkha about that. But that which is unconditioned doesn't change. And because it doesn't change, it isn't suffering, if that makes sense. So nirvana is nirvana, or this unconditioned, or nibbana in Sanskrit, nibbana in Pali, is difficult to understand because it is beyond concepts. And it's hard to perceive and realise. And the Buddha often used analogies, similes, and metaphors to describe the nature of this unconditioned and the nature of experiences in general, but also in particular about the unconditioned, because it's not that you can say this is what it is. It's more like what it is not. And in reference to Nibbana, he was reported to have said, this truth is profound, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful and sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning, subtle to be experienced by the wise. And a metaphor he used for Nibbana is as an extinguishing of a fire. I think the term Nirvana, I've understood the translation of the term Nirvana is as unbinding. I've also heard it as translated as not passion, or not fire, when fire was understood as passions. So it is not passion. So in this sense, this freedom is defined in terms of what it's not rather than what it is. And there's a paradoxical framework with this. It's like you're seeing something, you're not seeing something, but you're seeing something that it's not. If that makes sense. And the fire of that Nibbana is often referred to as cycling, and these wheels of cycling, suffering of samsara, like getting caught up in cycling. And in one translation, as I mentioned earlier, it is being unbound by these cycles. So we exit the cycles of birth, aging, sickness and death, and consciousness and craving and becoming and so on. I won't go through the dependent arising, but it's this kind of, we exit these cycles. So sometimes scholars have talked about Nibbana as being annihilation, but the Buddha did not confirm that. It's not annihilation, but rather than a nothing, the Buddha was reported to have said, in reference to Nibbana, that there is an unborn, an unbecome, an unmade, unconditioned, the existence of which makes possible escape from the born, the become, the made, and the conditioned. So, other practitioners, Nibbana has also been described as the highest happiness, ultimate peace, ultimate security, and freedom. See, this is a difficult thing to perceive, but it has been perceived by countless meditators over the millennia. Countless meditators who have practiced according to the teachings of the Buddha, and it's an invitation to come and see for oneself. So, when I was in the late 1970s, I ordained as a monastic and went and lived in the northeast forest traditions. Actually, I lived near Sukhumvit in what's called Isan in Thailand. And when I went to that monastery or those monasteries and I listened to the teachings, we didn't have books. I had a book of the rules for monks, but that was it. The rules of the monastics. And the instructions were really simple. They were to be mindful, to calm and still your mind, and then to inquire. That was it. That was the instruction. To be honest, they would say, go off and do Buddha, just say Buddha, everything's Buddha, which is a form of developing samadhi really, which is the quietening and stilling of the mind. And they would emphasise, however, to inquire, to look into phenomena. And these instructions represent the basic qualities that we find in meditation, the basic aspects of meditation being serenity and insight. So with serenity, we calm and still and quieten our minds, like a muddy pool is all stirred up and the sediment settles. We can then see clearly into the pond to see what's at the bottom of the pond. The insight is the seeing. And it's the seeing or the insight or the perception that is liberating. It's like what we see is this relationship between suffering and its causes and freedom from suffering and the causes of this. What we see is dependent arising, actually. And dependent arising is the principle from which the Buddha explained the coming into being of things and also their ceasing. And it's quite complicated and it's quite difficult to understand, yet it is sometimes described simply in the suttas like this. I'll see if I can quote it correctly. When this is, that is. With the arising of this, that arises. When this is not, that is not. With the ceasing of this, that ceases. I don't think I've got it completely accurate, but one gets the gist. It means that when, and in reference to the Four Noble Truths, when we have the poisons of greed, ignorance and hatred, or when we have craving, which is kind of like a major key in the cycle of suffering. When we have craving, we have dukkha. When there is no craving, there is no dukkha. So, this is the basic principle. When there's no greed, ignorance and hatred, there is no dukkha. So, we also see with insight the three characteristics of existence, or the three universal characteristics of existence, being everything is impermanent, everything is conditioned phenomena, because it's impermanent, is not able to give us ultimate satisfaction, and because everything is conditioned, there is no single thing that we can call ourself or a thing in all this. I look at that camera in front of me, I call it a camera, but in fact it's made up of I don't know how many component parts, all coming from everywhere, coming together, in time and space to be the concept called camera.
Like a human being.
Big pardon?
Like a human being.
Yeah, that's it, exactly. And what we are there's no solid abiding thingness here. We are the coming together of a whole range of causes and conditions, many of which are completely beyond our control, as well as our actions and our decisions. So there's no single thing that's there, but we're an interdependent dynamic. And what causes a lot of suffering is when we think we, designate an I, me, and myself to all this experience, and we cling on to it. We cling on to these self-concepts and the conceit I am, for example. So in reference to freedom, Samatha, who many of you are familiar with, Samatha is I think he must be about 85 or something now, in his 80s. I'm sure he's in his 80s, because when I met him, I gave him a massage, he was turning 50, and that was in 1980. He was turning 50 in 1980, so he would be, 83 or something like that. So, yeah. He'd be old. But anyway, he's a highly respected elderly monk, born in the United States, and has been monastic for many years. He often talks about the spaciousness of the heart-mind. And he uses an analogy of a room to talk about this spaciousness. And it's like in a room we have lots of objects, like there's a camera, there's people, cushions and batons and lounges and lights, and there's a framework, and there's a wall, there's roof. There's all these things that are in this room. And in this room, these objects come and go because they're conditioned experiences or they're conditioned phenomena. However, the space of this room doesn't come and go because it's always here. The space of this room, we never really look at the space. We just look at the conditions that come and go, and we call it a room with objects in it. But the space of this room, even in, a million years ago, the space of this room would have still been here. And in a million years henceforth, the space of this room will still be here. It is a context for which we understand, but we never really pay attention to the space of the room. We never really look at it. But when we do look at it, we can gain a very different perspective on this thing called room. And it's the same with ourselves. What we tend to look at with ourselves is we tend to identify with, we tend to see causes and conditions, the khandha, which are form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, as a me and I myself, and we just kind of fixate on that. But we don't tend to look at what's behind that. We don't tend to look at the spaciousness within that. It's the same with sound too. Sometimes somebody introduced listening to silence with me the other couple of months back. It was really interesting.
It's another Samatha.
Big one?
That's another Ajahn Samatha.
It is another Samatha, yeah. When you listen to the sounds, like we can hear sounds, we can hear crickets and frogs and the sounds of the evening, cars outside, me talking and so on. But underneath that, there is silence. There's a really quiet silence and stillness as well. We tend to fixate on things out there that are all changing. If, however, and this is somebody instructed me in this not so long ago too, to find the stillness in oneself, rather than, say if you're doing mindfulness of breathing, you're following the breath which is changing. If you become aware of the awareness that is aware of mindfulness of breathing, that's still. Like resting in the awareness of breathing, rather than tracking the breathing, you're tracking and resting in awareness. That's very still. So it's a shift in perspective. So, will I tell you about the developments? Can we go on for another 5 minutes? All right, so the time of the Buddha, he taught in India for about, he woke up and then he began teaching, and he taught for 45 years, and he passed into Parinibbana at the age of 80. And the tradition was oral, so it was transmitted by people remembering the discourses and then chanting them and passing them on through the chants. And we're not really quite sure what actually happened, but they say that there's possibility of a more accurate representation of the chanting from the chanting than there is from written words, because things get changed in translations. Anyway, from that time, the teachings started to be transmitted, started to travel. And they travelled north to Tibet, east to China and Japan, and south to Southeast Asia, and I think they even went as far as north into Mongolia and across to Europe, even into Greece, I think. As the teachings changed, as they travelled, they became adapted to the cultures within which they were hosted. So you see a lot of influences from these cultures adapting to Buddhism, and Buddhism adapting to them. So in this process, the core tenets or the core principles of the Four Noble Truths stayed the same, but the way they were interpreted and taught, and the way meditation was taught, and the various things that were priorities shifted and changed. And I'm sure you notice there's differences in the various traditions of Buddhism, depending on which tradition you practice with. When I did a retreat, I did an online retreat with Chan Master Venerable Gyalpo last year that was on emptiness. And he did this with Venerable Analia, which was a wonderful retreat. It was fantastic. On this retreat, Venerable Chan Master Gyalpo, who I think is a professor of Buddhism, he gave an outline of the developmental changes throughout these changes and these developments. And as far as he talked about the three major developments. The first one, he said, was the path of abandonment. And this would be related to early Buddhism, such as the Theravada tradition. And with the path of abandonment, it is about letting go of craving. Letting go of the causes of suffering. Then you realise freedom from suffering. The next development he spoke about was the path of transformation. And I think this is probably indicative of Mahayana Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, where there's a significant transformation. It's like you're embracing negative parts of yourself, and in the embracing of them, you become one. You transform them to their opposites and become one with that. I think that's a pretty simplistic explanation of it, but it's a path of transformation rather, by embracing the suffering and transforming it. And the third path he talked about was the path of recognition. And the path of recognition is about recognizing what is already here. Like in early Buddhism, it's about cultivating wisdom, and then with wisdom you see the way things are, and in the seeing you wake up. With this third development, which I think is indicative again of Mahayana Buddhism, but particular practices within Mahayana Buddhism, like I don't know much about MalHuxter or Dzogchen, but I know a little bit about some practices in Chan Buddhism, which is also Mahayana Buddhism, one being called silent illumination, which is just being present with experience. And there's another practice in Zen Buddhism, which I'm sure you guys will know about, shikantaza. which is the same. And lo and behold, there's another practice in Theravada Buddhism described in the sutras, in the shorter discourse on emptiness, and it's called sign of samadhi, which is described here sometimes. I think I described it about 6 months ago here on a talk, where we develop samadhi, but not around an object. It is just being present without any objects. So without having any signs. One way we can understand signs are the way we recognize things. The world is created with signs, concepts. We create the world with concepts. Like I'm sitting here and there's a room and Rosie's over there and there's a wall there and the camera there. There's this world created and my home's over that way and I've got to go to work tomorrow. I create this whole world of concepts. And what this particular meditation does is just be present. And it follows the teachings of the Buddha in the Bahia Sutta, where Bahia, a teacher, comes to the Buddha and requests the essence of the teachings. And the Buddha finally surrenders and says, yes, okay, this is the essence. Bahia. In the seen, there's just the seen. In the heard, there's just the heard. In the cognized, there's just the cognized. When Bahia, you can see this, then you're neither here, nor there, or anywhere in between. And that is the end of suffering. So, that's it. That's it. This is the path of recognition, and it's recognizing what is already here. So, this practice, what we do is we just be present. We don't feed into it with concepts, our perceptions with concepts. We are present with the raw experience of life. And what we begin to see is we begin to see through our mental constructions. We begin to see through them for what they are. And it's like, I was thinking about it the other day, remember those old, probably about 20 years ago, you used to get these images where it was just a mass of patterns and the task was to see a three-dimensional image in it. And you had to shift your focus,
Magic eye.
I think it was called a magic eye, yeah. And they're really cool because some people go, oh, what's going on here? And they say, oh, just focus out there and then look in here. So it's a kind of a bit of a trick with your focus and your perceptions. And you go, oh wow, look at that. There's a unicorn, or there's a dragon, or there's, whatever it is in this massive picture. It's kind of like that. When you stop and not feed into the conceptual creations of the world, when we're sitting in shikantaza, like I invited you to sit in just earlier in the meditation, not creating anything, we're just being present, then we see the unconditioned. We see our realities, our stories, what they are. We see how we create these stories. And in that seeing, there's great liberation. It's great freedom. So, thank you very much. I think that's enough for tonight's talk. May you be present with reality and discover or unveil the freedom of the unconditioned.